Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. Today, we're going to be talking about a new way of thinking. Our text is going to be Romans 12, 1 and 2, where Paul describes or presents some contrast between some old ways and some new ways that helps us gain some insight into what God expects of us, both in the way we live and in the way we think. But before we get into that, let me take just a minute to ask you to help us out by subscribing to the channel. It's very helpful to us if you'll subscribe and click the like button below. It tells YouTube that people like the content here, and that moves us up through their algorithm so that more people get a chance to see the video. So that's really helpful if you could do that, subscribe and like. Okay. So this idea from the Apostle Paul of thinking differently or learning a new way to think, what's that really all about? We're going to be reading, as we normally do, from my translation, the Simplified New Testament Study Bible. And here's what Paul has to say. So then, my brothers and sisters, considering the mercy God has shown you, does it not make sense that you give yourselves to Him completely, becoming a living sacrifice, keeping yourselves apart from the sinful ways of the world? That is the sensible and truly spiritual way to worship and serve God. You cannot live like people of the world. You must be a changed people, living differently because you learn to think differently, developing a new perspective on life. Your new perspective, then, will help you understand God's will and how He wants you to live. Paul says quite a few interesting things in this text. We're going to take a few minutes to kind of try to take it apart. The technical term is called exegete. We're going to exegete this text, take it apart, see what he says, and try to apply it in a way that will make sense and will help us in our relationship with God. The first thing that he says here, the thing that he wants to start with is this idea of God has done a great deal for us. You know, God became a human being in the person of Jesus. He came here, he lived a life, he offered himself as a sacrifice for sin. Because of what he did, we can receive forgiveness. We enjoy God's grace, God's mercy. You see, all those things. And Paul is saying, because God has done those things for us, we owe him something. We're obligated to him. We should live for him. We should give ourselves completely in his service. And he's saying that just makes good sense, doesn't it? Given what he's done for us, we need to do something for him. God doesn't really ask his people to die for him. Over the course of history, it's been necessary for some people to die for their faith. But on a day-to-day basis, most Christians aren't asked to die for their faith, but what God asks us to do instead is to live our faith, to live for him. And that's why Paul says in here, to become a living sacrifice. You see, Jesus died. He wants you to live for him, and to live effectively. He's willing to help you. He's going to come and live within you, and he's going to provide help and encouragement and comfort and do things to help you be the person that you can be, the very best version of you, living your life reflecting God's glory and image in the way you live. And he says, this is the truly sensible way to live and to serve and worship God. He says you need to stay away from the world. You need to live differently than people of the world live. What does that mean? I mean, I live in the world. I don't live on Mars. I don't live in outer space. I live here on planet Earth. I live in the world. So what does he mean when he says don't live like people of the world? Well, in the New Testament, there's a contrast, a way of helping us understand that has to do with the world versus the church. Okay? God's people, saved people, are the church. And as far as God is concerned, there's only two places for you to be. Either you've given your life to him and you're in the church, or you haven't and you're in the world. And the world represents, as it's put out there in the New Testament, the world represents sin, people who are separated from God, people who have not repented, people who have not accepted Jesus in faith, people who have not been baptized for the forgiveness of their sins, and they're still living in the world. Or they became a Christian, didn't think it was all that great, and they turned around, they went back into the world. But one way or the other, you have the people of the world versus the church, the people of God. And what Paul is saying here is that if you're one of God's people, then you need to live like one of God's people. You can't live like people in the world. Okay, you can't do that. You have to live differently if you're going to be one of God's people. And then he says in verse 2, he gives us the key to how we accomplish this. He says, again, you cannot live like people of the world. You must be a changed people. Now, he's writing to the whole church here, so he addresses the church, as a plural, all right, that you must be a changed people. But you can personalize this, right? And he's saying you must be a changed person, living differently because you learn to think differently. Well, that's a very important concept. Some translations talk about being transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's a good translation. It's okay. I don't think it's quite as easy to understand as the way I've translated it here. It's why I translated it differently. But the idea of being changed or being transformed is key to Paul's thought here. And it's interesting because the word that's translated into English as either transformed or changed is actually the Greek word metamorphosis, or that's how we say it in English, metamorphosis. Now, I remember when I first learned about this word was in my 10th grade biology class way back in the 1960s. And it had to do with the idea of the caterpillar who spins the cocoon around himself and then later emerges as a butterfly. And that process of transformation is called metamorphosis. Well, that's the word Paul uses here in this text. He says you must undergo a metamorphosis. You must undergo a transformation. I worded it, you must be changed. Change the way you think. Learn to think differently. Okay? Now, why? What's wrong with the way we think? Well, if you grew up in the world, you learn to think one way. And mostly, in the last 50 years, the focus on the world telling you how to think is that you have to be the most important thing. You have to think about yourself first before you think of anything else. You have to do what's best for you. You have to do what's right for you. You have to indulge yourself. And this permeates our thinking. It's everywhere out there. The problem with it is that it's very self-absorbed and narcissistic, right? Everything isn't about me. Everything isn't what I want or what I think or what I feel. See, that's just not a good way to live. And yet that's what the world emphasizes or what the world focuses on. Everything's about the individual. Part of what God tries to help us do is to learn to think differently. He wants us to be others-centered. Now, as I've said in a couple of other videos, there's nothing wrong with being self-interested to a degree. That we have a built-in survival instinct, and there's nothing wrong with that. When we're hungry, we eat. When we're tired, we rest. When we're thirsty, we drink. When we're lonely, we find somebody to spend some time with. We do things that we enjoy. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things, as long as we don't let it get out of hand to where everything is about what makes us happy, and everything is about what I want, and everything is about me. There are other things It isn't all just about me. There are other things that we have to think about, other things we have to be concerned about. So, one of the things Paul is saying here is if you want to be effective in living differently, if you want to be successful in living differently, you're going to have to learn to think differently. Okay, well, how different? Well, for the Christian, thinking differently, there's a whole list of things that you could put down there and say, these are the kinds of things that you might think differently about. One would be think differently about God. You know, some people think of God, and I think most people think of God, if they think of him at all, as kind of a big, harsh, judgmental kind of God, just looking for somebody to do something wrong so he can, squash them like a bug and send them straight to hell or something. And that's not God. That's not what God is like. That's not the way God behaves. God is a kind and loving Father who wants to be in a relationship with his children. He's done everything he can to help people enjoy a relationship with him. He's waiting there with open arms, waiting for people to come to him, and that's what he wants. And when you begin to grow and understand, you learn to think about God in those terms, and maybe that's different from the way you used to think about God. You think differently about Jesus. He isn't just some Jewish rabbi who got himself in trouble and got crucified by the Romans. Jesus was God living as a human being, showing us how to live, offering himself as a sacrifice of atonement. You see, many people don't think of Jesus in those terms, but Christians do. Christians will learn to think differently about morality. The world says there are no moral absolutes. Whatever you want to do, as long as you can, explain why it's okay for you to do this, then it's okay for you to do that. There's no moral absolute. Morality is, what's okay with everybody, and as long as it doesn't hurt anybody, then it's okay. And very kind of a loose idea where nothing is actually absolutely right or wrong. Well, Christians know better than that. Moral absolutes exist, and so when you become a Christian, your thinking is going to change about morality. Your thinking is going to change about sin. What is sin? And I can't take time to get into that in this video. We'll do another video on that. But you learn to change the way you think about things. As a Christian, you'll change the way you think about reality. You'll change the way you think about what's really important. You'll change the way you think about the purpose of life, the purpose of your life. Why are you here? And where are you going? And what do you do in the meantime? Christians change their thinking in all sorts of ways. And it's that changed mindset, a new way of looking at the world, a new way of thinking about things that help us live more effectively. One of the things about cognitive psychology is that it focuses on the idea that if you can help somebody change their mind about something, then you can help them change their behavior about things that are associated with that. I kind of chuckle because there's a weight loss program being advertised right now on TV. I won't mention it by name, but it's rooted in the cognitive therapy approach. And it's the idea that if you help people think differently about nutrition, think differently about food, think differently about what you eat, when you eat it, why you eat it, and all that sort of stuff, then people can actually change their eating habits, which will help them lose weight. And that's what the approach is, okay? It's basically cognitive therapy applied to weight loss, okay? Now, Paul wasn't a psychologist. Psychology didn't even exist in the first century. But what he's talking about is the same idea. When a Christian begins to think differently, then it's much easier for a Christian to begin to live differently, to live the way God wants you to live. And so that's what Paul's talking about in this text. He's saying, look, think about what God has done for you. It's only right that you reciprocate, that you live as a living sacrifice. You give your life to God and change the way you think, and then that will help you change the way you live. Because you can't live like people in the world. You have to live the way God wants you to live. And the really cool thing about all this is that it's not just left up to us. It's not up to me. God didn't say, you have to change the way you do. He says, hey, I'll help you. I'm here. Let's do this together, okay? And that's why he gives us the Spirit to live in us, to help us learn to think differently and learn to behave differently and to incorporate new traits in our behaviors so that we can be better people. We can be less like our old sinful selves and more like God. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video today. I hope it's been helpful. I hope I said something that will matter in a positive way to you. I hope you'll watch more of our videos, but thank you for watching this one, and God bless.